Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast, where we look for insights beyond the headlines to take a practitioner's view on national security and geopolitics. It's the 29th of February, 2024. Let's dive in. Now, today we're talking about something that is out of this world, quite literally. We are going to be talking about space, and not just how cool the new Space Force uniforms are, or how terrible, depending on how you want to look at it, but we're going to be talking about how space has emerged as a new area of competition between states. Now, in a way, it always has been. If you go back to the space race in the 60s and the race to the moon and Sputnik and all that fun stuff at the beginning of the Cold War, space has always been a place where states have tried to compete in technological advancement, in technology development, research efforts, also just prestige. You know, it's prestigious to have the first satellite. It's prestigious to orbit the planet. It's prestigious to go to the moon. In a way, it's a mark of being a great power to be able to go up into the sky and plant your flag, literally and figuratively. But in this era of great power competition, it has become an area of renewed emphasis for the U.S. government and also our geopolitical rivals around the world. Most obvious example of this you can see is that we now have a Space Force. We already had NASA, and we went so hard in the paint with competition in the space that we made a military branch dedicated to it. The nature of how we're looking at this domain is changing rapidly. Now, to help unpack this and to explore why space has reemerged as an area of geopolitical competition and why it's something that we need to commit critical resources to as a nation state in order to secure our future, we're going to be talking to John Klein. Now, John Klein is a senior fellow and space strategist and author of Fight for the Final Frontier, Irregular Warfare in Space. Great book. Link to it will be in the show notes. You should all go check it out. He teaches at Georgetown and George Washington University and has been studying space and writing about competition in space for decades. Really excited to get a chance to talk to him and pick his brain about why space has emerged as an area of competition between states, why this new competition between states is different than our previous way of competing in space. What's going on here? Is this just more of the same? Why are we making new institutions? What are our rivals doing? And dive into where we need to look to see what the future of space competition and its effects on every other aspect of our lives, both in the public and private sector, is going to take us. With that, let's get to our conversation with John Klein. John, good morning and welcome to the podcast, sir. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Really excited to dive into this topic. It's been top of mind in the news recently. Two news stories I've seen, even just this morning. We've apparently landed a private spacecraft on the moon, and the Russians are putting nukes in space. So this is a great topic to dive into today.
Yeah, definitely in the headlines and current events, space is hot.
Yeah, which is weird because it's so cold. Oh, that's a terrible joke. Had to do it. Had to do it. Oh, man. All my nerd friends will be happy. So real quick before we start talking about state competition in space, can you introduce yourself to the audience in your own words and give them a bit of your background and expertise in this area?
Sure. I'm John Klein. I have my Navy call sign of Patsy from Patsy Cline, the country music singer. I did naval aviation for about 22 years. Got to see the world, support combat ops in Iraq and Afghanistan. So after that chapter closed, I ended up supporting the predecessor organizations to the U.S. Space Force. I do that for a day job, and then I teach space policy and strategy at a few universities in the Washington, D.C. area. And then I like to write books about space warfare and all sorts of things related to that.
Awesome. We brought up a couple interesting things there, but Space Force really set the tone for space becoming first and foremost in the policy minds of the American national security establishment. A lot of people laughed about it when Trump rolled that out. There was plenty to laugh about at the time, admittedly, but it really did indicate a strong pivot into a new area of not just exploration, but competition with other states. So could you walk us through why space is becoming a new domain of competition between states, not just regular who gets to the moon first competition that we remember from the 60s, but interstate competition?
Yeah, wonderful question. If I end up going long, please give me the hook, but this is important. So we've had competition in space since the dawn of the space age. So the reason we developed space capabilities was following World War II and the attacks of Pearl Harbor. We no longer wanted to have strategic surprise. So we went to airborne reconnaissance after the U-2 shoot down, then we went to space-based reconnaissance and the like. So we wanted to be able to see what our competitors or rivals were doing to prevent that type of happenings again. So competition and national security and space have been tied together since the beginning. But to your question is, what's different now? Why is it always in the headlines? Space started being was overly classified. It had to do with treaty verification and compliance. Anything related to space, was classified. The National Reconnaissance Office's existence was classified. But, those activities are now more in the open. You also have the democratization of space. So that gives access to more people to put up satellites, to have access. You mentioned the lunar lander yesterday, had university payloads, had commercial payloads, so more people can use it. And the other thing I think is technology is finally catching up to our ambitions. We have SpaceX having reusable launch. We can get live stream video and see all the cool stuff happening in space. You have commercial companies that have space domain awareness that can track satellites on orbit. So I think a combination of those three things kind of led to this increased sense of competition. But the other part is we're going back to the moon, as yesterday's landing kind of indicated. We have the Artemis program, Artemis Accords associated with that, which we can talk about more. And China is going to go to the moon too as part of its national agenda. So thanks.
Awesome. Well, just because you brought up Artemis, I have to give a quick shout out to my friend Sarah Maltese from high school, who's one of the lead electrical engineers on the Orion capsule for the Artemis program. So
wonderful.
Since you brought that up, shout out to Sarah.
Okay. Well done, Sarah. Keep it up.
Yeah, no. She was a smart one. I joined the Army. Anyway, so with that, with greater access to space, is the purpose of an organization like Space Force then just to be a regulatory body that deconflicts with all these civilian agencies, or is there more of a militaristic interstate competition from a hard power point of view?
Okay. If General Raymond answered that question, he was the first chief of space operations, and he said, Space Force is not NASA. Okay, so it is a military organization. If you look up Title 10, what's in U.S. law, organize, train, and equip, its mission statement includes, protecting national security interests in the space domain. So it is a military branch. We don't have, unlike Green Berets that might be out in the field, we don't have Space Force officers flying around in space or on the moon, walking around, or putting boots on the moon, or as the Netflix comedy used to say. So that way is different, but it is focusing on competition, crisis, and potential conflict in the space domain. The Space Force is the service. We do have a combat command, U.S. Space Command, which is Space Force presents forces to the combatant command, and then U.S. Spacecom will actually employ those like other combatant commands to protect national security interest or support the joint warfight, as the case may be.
Okay, so is this increase of institutional capacity for space operations, is this more to increase capacity for the joint force, or is there a standalone set of activities that we're expecting our, what are they called, guardians to be undertaking in the Space Force?
Well, your question, Scott, brings up a fundamental question, and it's still being hotly debated, and it depends on who you ask. So I kind of use the old Navy guy. I'll use a maritime analogy. It's the difference between the blue water or the brown water Navy. Do space forces support the terrestrial fight? Is that their objective, or do they look at space-on-space activities too? The U.S. Navy came to the conclusion you got to be able to do both. whether we're putting Marines ashore or conducting blue water operations against another rival's Navy, you got to be able to operate in both regimes. So the U.S. Space Force is supporting the joint fight for potential combat operations, but it's also looking at space-on-space activities in their own right.
Okay. And what would those types of activities be? Is this shooting down enemy satellites, putting tungsten rods up there to drop on enemy capitals? Like what are these space-specific military actions that we're now contemplating employing?
Okay, so we'll first do a distinction because this is always a hot one. So there's a difference between militarization of space and weaponization of space. Space has been militarized since the beginning. We have had military activities, whether it's command and control through satellite communications, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance of exquisite satellites. So, and then of course everyone's favorite is the global positioning system, GPS. I can get tacos and pizzas delivered to my house courtesy of the U.S. Space Force. So those capabilities have been part of it. That's military utility. So the weapons is different, and that's where things get kind of there's a lot of passion when we talk about what should be the role of weapons. Should we weaponize? Should we just let it go like we do every other domain? And that's an important difference. So your question was, what does the Space Force do? They have mission areas like other services do. We mentioned satellite communications, surveillance, reconnaissance, GPS, helping support precision fires, space domain awareness, and there's some other ones too. So it's in that context. Sometimes you'll talk about offensive and defensive operations like we do in the other services. That's an option for the U.S. Space Force as well. Sometimes it's called counter space or space control. It goes by a different vernacular, but it does run a variety of different mission areas, and some of them we just take for granted. Space-based weather is an important thing. It's usually the unsung hero, but very few military operations go down unless you have a very good, accurate forecast.
Weather is key, especially when you're on the ground or jumping out of airplanes. I will vouch for that. We want good weather forecasts.
Yes, you do. And, those are civilian capacity, mostly through NOAA and the like, but there's some other capabilities too.
Okay. What is America's broad strategy for space? Because, the Army has a strategy, the National Defense Service strategy, the services have their own strategies that they put forward that guide their training and doctrine and development. What is the American strategy in space, or what is the driving goal that sounds like we don't have a strategy yet? What's the driving goal that we're building a strategy around? Okay.
So you kind of hinted at my answer because you mentioned, the Army has the National Defense Strategy and higher guidance. Space Force does too. I always teach, when I teach my classes, I always say, I don't teach a space policy course. I teach a policy course focusing on space. So space is not special in its own way. It's just different. So it needs to be able to plug into these higher level guidance, just like the services do. But in general, to answer your question, the United States is the world leader when it comes to space capabilities, economic sector, and the like. So they want to maintain their leadership role and work with allies and partners to have a like-minded approach to space activities, responsible space behaviors, and just how we kind of operate in space. Not all our rivals agree with that, but that we are looking. Sometimes you can call it the status of the strategy of the status quo. We are happy with our position in the world. We would like to maintain that. We do have U.S. space policy. We have a 2020 national space policy through the previous administration. This administration has a space priorities framework, but it basically just kind of links space is important to U.S. national power, whether it's national security, economic, it's health and well-being. It's just this idea of pursuing your dreams, and space is looked to as inspirational activity, which we want to kind of help out too. The idea of space sustainability is also important. We're putting more and more satellites in orbit. When those become defunct or there's debris, we call that space junk. So it is it's very encompassing on how it supports the national objectives, just like the other services.
You started to mention there some of the things that our rivals might be doing. What are our geopolitical rivals doing in space, and did any of their activities specifically trigger this re-engagement of space as a critical domain for national security?
I think I don't think their activities changed it. It's just highlighted some contention. Well, first talking to Russia, I have no idea what Russia's doing. The headlines.
Russia doesn't know what Russia is doing.
I'll go back to their anti-satellite testing from a few years ago, where they blew up one of their own satellites, created a lot of debris. They knew what they were doing. I have no idea why they would do that. It was right before the Ukraine invasion. Were they signaling? I don't know. The folks I talked to were kind of shrugging. What was that about? Now, China is an interesting one because they do publish in English their 5-year white paper plan, but they've been noticing that human spaceflight and space in general is good for the Chinese Communist Party. Part of their leadership goals, whether it's economic, national security, promoting science and technology, and social progress. So they've embraced that off and on for decades, but more recently in the last 2. So that's really helpful. They're going back to the moon too. They're trying to have they're going to have a space station. They do have a space station now. They're looking to have a lunar base, along with just like we do have our Artemis program. They have their own rule set, their own agendas. We have our allies. We have 35 countries signed up as part of the Artemis Accords. They're looking to have their set of partners too. China's worldview is different than ours in the West, and I think we know that. We need to acknowledge it. It's not a judgment call of who's right or who's wrong. I'm a big fan of Western liberal democracies and what they value. Way China approaches legal regimes. Whenever I write, I'll talk about this idea of lawfare. So it's intentional distortion of legal regimes for competitive advantage. In the West, we like to say rule of law. So law protects the rights of the individual, property, and that. But Chinese cultural understanding of the purpose of law and the legal regimes is different. The law is a tool of the party. Okay, it's rule by law instead of rule of law. So it's this idea that, well, yeah, you're going to use legal instruments to achieve your political agendas. It's just a different construct. China and Russia both have some great on-orbit capabilities. Open source stuff, they have some great maneuvering capabilities with their SJ-21, SJ-17 satellites. Russia's displayed some behaviors with some of its satellites too. That's what's brought it to the attention. That's why the U.S. leadership says space is now a war-fighting domain. So the U.S. Space Force and its combat commands will plan for potential conflict in the space domain itself based on these nefarious or construed as threatening behaviors of both Russia and China.
Interesting. So it really does sound like that you take an actor like China. Let me ask you this. Everything you described about what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to do in space, how much do they actually care about technological advancements they can achieve through space exploration and the activities they're doing? And how much is this just domestic messaging to their own domestic population that they're doing so well and they're increasing their standing in the world? Do they really care about the science and technology aspect of this, or is this more of a national pride to get credibility in the world stage and also signal strength to their domestic constituency?
I'd hate to do a blanket statement. I think there's probably folks in China that actually care about the science and the exploration, and then they have that. And our delegations talk to their delegations, so I believe there are those. For the CCP's long-term goals, it's prestige. It has a domestic context for touting the achievements. So when you look at the strategic level, I think it is more of that, of their long-term prestige. But China's a civilization over 5,000 years old. We're the new upstart over here in the U.S., so They see this idea of the Middle Kingdom extending to the moon and outward to the rest of the solar system and beyond, just part of their natural destiny. And sometimes you'll see in their writings, they construe our behaviors trying to limit their achievements, their expansion, and their ambitions. And from their point of view, how dare we, us upstart? You should know your place in this world order.
Nice. Yeah, that does seem to be a consistent theme across our engagement with China in multiple domains. The more I'm listening to this, the more it sounds like the way you framed your initial course, you teach a policy course that focuses on space, not a space policy course. But what, if any, are unique aspects of how space changes the dynamic between states that need to be considered? Do our traditional frameworks for how we understand interstate competition, whether it's liberalism, realism, constructivism, just war theory, pick a theory, any theory, do those need to be adjusted for space, or is this just par for the course, same old, nothing's really changed?
That's one of these areas I love to talk about. So I've been writing books on space warfare for close to 2 decades now. It's a really bad hobby. I don't advise writing as a hobby because your nights and weekends are consumed, but it's a lot of fun. So fundamentally, we'll go to Karl von Clausewitz's On War and his principles. There's the enduring nature of war, and I'd say there's an enduring nature of geopolitical competition and the like. So space is just part of that. So you can look to the writings of Thucydides, Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, B.H. Littlehart, J.C. Wiley, Mao Zedong, if you want to look at some good ideas for insurgencies and irregular warfare. But, space is just fitting into that construct because war is ultimately about people and their politics, and that's kind of regardless of the domain. So I think all your international relations theory still applies. But the other part is, there's the enduring nature of war and competition, but each domain has its own character. So space war has a different and changing character than the other domains. And I think that's kind of Clausewitz kind of talks about the spirit of the age, how each, as technology evolves, the character of how we consider competition, conflict changes. So the space domain is not the land domain, it's not the maritime domain or the air domain. There's different physics. It's a different environment. It's very hostile. We can't put a company of soldiers and march them to the moon. There's different technology requirements. But there's a lot of similarities too. Early on, we used a lot of analogies with the other domains to consider it. But fundamentally, if I had to say, you can use those other books. You can look at national policy, and you can say, how does space help with that? But there is a small and growing volume of literature on space power theory. I write about space strategy. U.S. Space Force has space doctrine now, which is sometimes aligned with joint doctrine. But yeah, it's growing, but we have to be able to live in the paradox. There's some sameness, but some differentness also.
So one of the things that some folks like to talk about, especially when we look back at the early days of the space race, is this idea that if we got outside of our own planet, and even got outside of our own solar system, somehow, since we're looking outward, not inward, we're going to reach this kumbaya moment where global humanity is going to come together and the UN's going to govern well and we're all just going to get along, and Francis Fukuyama's end of history is actually going to happen. And, the exploration of space is going to be what drives that evolution in human society. It sounds like we're seeing the opposite happen.
As far as international cooperation goes?
Yeah. It sounds like we're doubling down on a competitive sphere instead of reaching this beautiful kumbaya moment.
Yeah, well, so, even our international frameworks, our legal regimes, the Outer Space Treaty, Spaces for Peaceful Purposes, that was drawn up in the heat of the Cold War. A lot of folks were concerned about U.S. and Soviet Union going to the moon, putting nuclear weapons on the moon, putting them in space. So there was a lot of angst there. I think the futurists, the aspirational people, the folks who look at colonization, they see the space domain differently. Maybe some of the realists or neo-realists see it differently as well. But if you look at our treaties and what we've agreed to, there's always been this underlying bit about competition. We say, we're supposed to share in the benefits of space with everyone. Usually as it's played out, and I'd say it's been playing out for some time, it's a first come, first served type of domain where, especially in low Earth orbit, the countries that can plink up their mega constellations seem to get the altitude or orbital regimes that they want. If you're a latecomer, is there anything left for you? So I don't know. But, the fundamental question about, when we go to Mars, and Elon Musk does have the aspiration in his lifetime to get to Mars and have landings there, what is the legal regime? Do earthbound frameworks, regulations, laws apply to a new celestial body? He would say no. Others would say no. But the way our frameworks are done, the launching state has all the responsibilities for registration, liability. So when we send payloads to the moon and Mars, there's still this tie-in. What country did it? It's not even which company did it. You have to be sponsored or be affiliated with a state.
That seems like that could open up a very interesting avenue of competition if a foreign state like China or India or whoever managed to reach a celestial body before the U.S. or one of our closer allies and lay claim to the resources there. I know the idea of actually harvesting resources from other celestial bodies is still a little far out, but in all the science fiction, that's top of mind, and theoretically, it's not impossible. It's just not practical. Is that something that America needs to be concerned with? Could someone actually gain a massive geopolitical advantage over us simply by reaching harvestable celestial bodies first?
This idea of resource extraction, it sounds fanciful. I'm going to tell you we are closer than you may give us credit for.
Really?
So most people think about planetary resources, we think about gold and platinum, these precious metals. The most valuable commodity, in my view and in others, on celestial bodies is water ice. It's not gold and platinum. So if you were to bring, let's say you've seen in the news, trillions and trillions of dollars of gold and platinum in some of these asteroids. Say somehow you brought those down to Earth. As we know by Economics 101, it's supply and demand. So you've just spent a whole lot of money and you bring it down and put it in the system, you've just collapsed your market. And so the only people making money are the ones that actually short the system for the commodities and the trades. But water ice is different. There's water ice on the moon. On the lunar south pole and some of the craters, they're finding more and more of it. There may be more than just on the south pole, but we think we're seeing a new gold rush. It's on the moon. People are trying to get to the water ice. So why water ice? H2O, you can separate into hydrogen for fuel, oxygen to breathe, and you can just melt it and drink it. So if you're going to have human exploration, water, H2O is a very important component in that, especially if we try to grow stuff there too. So that's the latest thing. There's some contracts NASA has with commercial companies. If you can bring process 1 kilogram of water ice or the like, you can make some money. So that's where it's at on the resource. Some of the spots on the moon are considered more have higher levels of concentration of water ice. So we are seeing some India, China, U.S. commercial companies all potentially vying for these same spots. Then it begs up the question, how close is too close? How do we cooperate but compete? Those are some open questions. The Artemis Accords tried to address some of that, but we are not in agreement. And we're not even in agreement with some of our allies that commercial companies can conduct resource extraction, because the Outer Space Treaty says you can't claim sovereignty. So if nobody owns the moon, How do you license a commercial company to go get stuff and take it for profit? Still up for debate.
Interesting. Let me ask you about disagreement among our allies. So we create this space force. I didn't even think about this. How did our allies react when we created this military branch that's now supposed to be focused on space? Because I can imagine a few people that would rub the wrong way. How'd that go over?
My views only. Some of the words that were used when it was founded were not helpful. So the word of space dominance, the United States is going to dominate space, caused a lot of teeth sucking with our allies. They don't want to be dominated. Okay, they want to have cooperation and a collegial environment. But we've kind of backed down from some of that rhetoric. Mostly our closest allies, our Five Eyes, and some others are on board. We have our allies standing up equivalent of space forces or space commands. They update their own doctrine to match ours and the way we call things, which I'm sure they get tired of because we seem to reinvent our lexicon every couple of years on that. But I'd say overall, they're getting there. Their military forces don't compare in the numbers of ours, so it's hard for them to kind of break out separate commands like we do in the United States for some of our allies. But they're there and they're trying to match us. Even our rivals, China and Russia have kind of identified space as a component of some of their forces, strategic space forces for China, I believe it's called. So the rollout was really bad, in my view.
Gotcha. Fair enough. You mentioned before this idea of irregular warfare being a component of our activities in space. Irregular warfare, I heard a lot of different people define it in a lot of different ways. I normally hear it as code for somebody saying, I have this really cool idea and I don't know where it fits, so I'm going to throw it under this IRW umbrella. But could you walk us through what irregular warfare is in your view, and then explain to us how space is fitting into this mode of competition?
Excellent. And it is a term that's thrown around a lot. So I'll go to a definition. Irregular warfare is apart from major conventional wars against an enemy who takes a similar approach. I got this from some experts on irregular warfare. Now, you and your audience are going to start rolling your eyes when you think about that definition, because I just defined irregular warfare as the opposite of regular warfare. So, but that's what we do in strategic studies all the time. We have the direct and indirect approaches. We have symmetry and asymmetric operations. So, irregular warfare only has meaning in terms of regular warfare. But why I think the irregular warfare framework is good for thinking about competition, crisis, and potential conflict in space is what we're seeing in the last few decades. And that's kind of what I struggled with. Like I said, I was writing on it, but in a Clausewitzian sense, we weren't seeing total major force-on-force conflicts in space. We weren't seeing peace either. We were seeing jamming, lazing happening all the time, proximity operations. We have GPS jamming of going on in Ukraine on both sides. So this idea of something was happening, but nobody was dying. This wasn't major conflict. So I said, well, let's use an irregular warfare lens on that. So these are actions that are below the threshold of what we would consider armed conflict in the U.S., where you can't invoke all these treaty obligations. So if you look at that, and there are some good works on irregular warfare, a side off-ramp, and considering your background, it must be some chagrin. We're starting to do the memory dump on Iraq and Afghanistan of all the stuff we learned about irregular warfare. Now we're back to great power competition. Let's go back to the Cold War doctrine. We have to be able to do both the high end and the low end. We got to be able to have strategies for irregular warfare and regular warfare. But most of the stuff that's going on, I would consider irregular. I mentioned those examples. And you and your audience may wonder, so what's an example of regular warfare for space? That's your rods from God. That's your direct descent hit to kill ASATs that blow up an exquisite satellite or a GPS constellation. That's major kinetic kill vehicles that cause large amounts of debris. So the acts of violence, or acts that we have people in space now, so people can die as a part of irresponsible actions or actually intentional malign actions too. So those are some examples. I think it's a useful framework, and I try to lay out some appropriate strategies, taking what we learned in the land domain, because, as we know, we can take those enduring principles and apply them anywhere.
Let me ask you this about irregular warfare, because I'm listening to the definition, I'm trying to think it through, and I think I have a corollary for it, but I want to get your thoughts on it. If we look back to how America was doing economic competition and proxy wars throughout the Cold War, it seems like we were doing what the definition of irregular warfare would be defined as very effectively around the world. And then Cold War ends, and we have this unipolar moment with America, liberal hegemony, great. World comes together, first Gulf War, awesome. And then we have like this decade of hanging out, and then we get distracted by GWAT, and we just forgot how to do interstate competition. Whereas China, Russia, Iran's going, well, we can't fight the U.S. directly, but we have all these other things that they just don't even pay attention to. So I'm just kind of curious, is this term irregular warfare just a term that is used to rebrand a skill set that America has forgotten over the past 30 years? Or is there something more to it?
Yeah, I call myself a space strategist. To me, there's something more to it. It's a framework. It's a lens. But you brought up a wonderful point. Our rivals have our number. They cannot compete with us one-on-one militarily. I would postulate we are still the supreme military power in the world, and even in the space domain. China and Russia would gladly trade places with us. We like to beat ourselves up about it whenever we're testifying in front of Congress or justifying multi-billion-dollar defense programs. You got to kind of play up your rivals for that. But we're doing quite well. But this idea of proxies operating below the threshold of armed conflict, sometimes it's labeled gray zone. There's a slide, this idea of regular warfare has been around for millennia. It's been called different things. 100 years ago, it was small wars. We had the Marine Corps manual, small wars. We had terrorism, insurgencies. We have rendezvous and proximity operations. And so there's a whole list of it. The proxies is a fascinating one for me because let's talk about mercenaries. So Sean McFate will write about that in his books. We have a euphemism in the West of, we call them private military companies. But if you look at what the role of a private military company is, it usually is provide training and education, logistical support, or security. In that case, potential use of force. In the space domain, we're starting to see logistical support. We're having refueling on orbit in the geostationary belt of satellites. So, what happens when, our rivals or a third party has a commercial company that provides private military company proxy capabilities for hire? Force for hire goes back millennia. We've been doing it. If you can't compete, you just buy the capability. So your question was, is it more than that? It is buzzwords and jargon because it gets people's attention. It's gone by many, many names. We just need to know our history and how space kind of fits into that.
Okay, that's fair enough. You brought up some interesting stuff there with private military companies and privatization of force over time and mercenaries. One of the things that we are seeing, and I'm curious how this plays into space competition, is with, SpaceX and Blue Horizon or Origin or all these companies, we are seeing the privatization of space activities. Of course, it's happening here in the U.S. first. One of the things that I would argue is one of the reasons we're struggling to compete economically with China or to counter China effectively right now in the economic space is because the U.S. government fully outsourced all economic planning to the free market. If you look at diplomacy, information, military, economic, we've got institutions for everything but economy. And there's been pros to cons of that. Right now, we're really seeing some of the cons perk up, and we're taking some steps to adjust it. do we run the risk of hamstringing our ability to compete against other state actors in space if we divest too much of the space domain and critical activities in it to the private sector? Obviously, there's a great upside to innovation. You don't want to stifle that, but there's trade-offs there, and we seem to have gone way too far down one end on the economic space. Are there lessons we can learn there as we approach the privatization of space?
Yeah, so this is a topic that is hotly debated. So what's the role of government and what's the role of the commercial sector or even the civil sector? So how should you do it? As you mentioned, the commercial sector is able to innovate quicker, have better economies of scale than the government. For whatever reason, we are a large bureaucracy, and it still takes us sometimes years to field a system. And by then, you've had probably 3 or 4 cycles of innovation that have happened then, and so you're putting stuff on orbit that is already obsolete or not state of the art. So the idea of finding out ways to use industry, commercial space companies to help you with that, that's something that's fully embraced. But what are those functions that are inherently governmental, right? The application of military force, we don't want to outsource that, right? How are we going to try you for a court-martial if you're not part of the military on that? So there's certain functions that the government needs to do or wants to at least be primary. Maybe we still need commercial backups. You know, what's the harm in having a commercial backup, the GPS, or having some way to provide positioning, navigation, and timing? That's a question. I'm the optimist. I think we're muddling our way through. I believe the commercial sector is part of how we outcompete China and our rivals. Besides our wonderful military, I would say what the U.S. has as strategic advantages is we have better allies and partners than our rivals. I would say Russia and China, their partners, at least Russia's are mostly coerced. China's are less than ours. But it's our, the commercial companies that are doing well, they come to the United States for a reason. We have a great intellectual property. We kind of don't even pay attention to it. We take it for granted. But this idea that, your innovation is yours and not to be owned by the state. And this idea we have our regulatory system gets speed up a lot. It is far from perfect, but it is solid and it is conducive for companies to be profitable and innovate and explore and try new things. So I think it is part of how we outcompete, especially as technology continues to advance. It was not chance that NASA outsourced to a commercial company on yesterday's landing. Just this idea, this is probably a cheaper, faster way to operate.
Okay. Well, with that, I think I've run to the end of my narrative arc of questions here, but we still have a bit of time left. So if you'd like, could you please tell us about this book that you're apparently working on?
Okay. Thank you. So the last book I came out with was Fight for the Final Frontier, Irregular Warfare in Space. I teach classes, so you could call me an academic of sorts, but because, I served, if a strategy doesn't provide solutions, then it's useless. So the last chapter, I tried to take the lessons that we've learned through irregular warfare, counterinsurgencies, terrorism over the last few decades, and say, hey, what are the lessons that we can take for that? I had the privilege of studying under the late Colin Gray. For my money, the best strategic mind of the last 100 years, wrote 30 books, hundreds of chapters and articles. But I took one of those papers that he did for the Army War College back in 2006 on irregular warfare. And again, it was the enduring principles of irregular warfare on how our strategy should embrace it. We talk about the American way of fighting. There's others that have been talking about that for decades too. But I tried to offer up if China and Russia are operating below the threshold of armed conflict, using protracted strategy, they're using the element of time because we lose attention quickly and move on to the next thing. The indirect approach, I'm going to use means and methods that are not necessarily direct military confrontation, and then seeking asymmetric advantage. So how do we compete? I come up with like a list of 10 ideas. I was told by my publisher, don't give away the baby when you're talking, so but I'll let you give those. But what's the so what? 3/4 of those recommendations are non-material solutions. Okay? There's things that we have to buy. We need better space domain awareness, ways to attribute. We need more offensive and defensive means. There's hardware. There's shiny things that are involved. But updating our strategies to include regular and irregular approaches, working with allies and partners, working with commercial on innovation and the like. So there's a lot of things we can do now besides the hardware piece. One of my surprises on this book was the Special Operations Force community was coming out, hey, how can we help? You have our attention, right? And, there's a role.
Always want to get there first. Don't know what we're going to do when we get there, but we just got to get there first. We'll figure it out then.
Yeah. So I said, hey, just help us remember the lessons before we do the dump. I'd say the soft community is pretty much where all this core knowledge over the last few centuries is kept, so we don't have to relearn it. I will tell the soft community, when I was talking to some Army people, there's this triad of cyber, space, and soft that they're working. Mm-hmm. Irregular warfare in space is more than just the ground segment. It's more than just the terrestrial fight. There's activities you can do in space that are below the threshold of armed conflict to coerce would-be rivals or to affect their deterrence calculus and the like. So there's more to do, but I appreciate that question, Scott.
Awesome. Well, I think I've run out of stuff to go through. Really appreciate you taking the time. Is there anything else you'd like to share while we're here?
Nope. I appreciate it. For all the armchair strategists out there. You serve a great purpose. I'm not sure I said it here, but if I told my students, if you want a new idea, read an old book. So don't hesitate to pick up an old book and see how it applies to today.
Awesome. And if you can shoot me a link to where folks can buy your book, I will throw it in the show notes when I publish the episode.
Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for listening in today. If you liked what you heard, please follow the podcast and share with your friends, and even consider going to the support the show link in the episode description. Thank you, and I'll see you all next time.